That was author Matthew Desmond in conversation with Jon Stewart about how we could, without doing much different, could literally wipe out poverty in this country. These are policy decisions. Joining me right now is Imani Gandy, editor-at-large for Rewired News Group, where she covers law and the courts, and co-hosts the Rewired News Group podcast, Boom Lawyered. And today we're going to have a conversation about a topic that she had actually posted on, I think this might have been over a year ago now, but it was reposted. And I believe, Imani, when you first posted this, I talked about the article, but you weren't on with me to talk about the article. And I think the points of the article are so much more salient and relevant now than they ever have been that I wanted to bring it back, because just like poverty is a choice, so is racial discrimination. And you say a lot in this article about not necessarily fighting to go back to what used to be, but really taking a completely different approach to our questions of diversity, equity, and inclusion in this country. One, welcome back to the show, and let's get into it.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be here. And, you know, I really like the way that you phrase that. Racial discrimination is a choice. It is a choice that we have made as a country. Yeah. There was about 14 years in the late 60s or early 70s where white people were like, maybe we could choose differently. And we had two presidents who implemented the affirmative action program, right? And under the program, this is Lyndon Johnson and JFK. They both contemplated quotas. They contemplated set-asides for Black people. I'm going to say reparative set-asides for Black people. And then by 1978, in the landmark case, Regents of California versus Bakke, the Supreme Court said, you know what? Quotas and racial set-asides, they don't uphold the colorblind ideals of the United States, which is just a hilarious thing to say after you've had about 13 years of moving towards equality, 13 years of choosing equity as a choice. You decide that now's the time that we got to uphold the colorblind ideals of this Constitution. After 250 years, we're going to give Black people a hot 13 years. And then we're going to be like, you know what? This isn't fair to white people, which is essentially what happened in 1978. And then again in the early 2000s with the cases out of University of Michigan, the case, and then in the 2012-13 with the case out of Texas, Fisher, Becky with the bad grades. You remember Becky with the bad grades?
With the bad grades.
And so, what we're doing here, and now we're in an administration where you've got the most mediocre white people, the most mediocre white people who are looking at the most accomplished Black people and saying to them, you're only here because of DEI. You're not qualified. You're inherently unqualified to hold the position that you have. And we need to get back to a merit-based society where we're firing the Black Joint Chiefs of Staff, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and hiring some retired white guy who wasn't even as high star of a general as the Black guy we fired. We're going to go ahead and fire the Admiral of the Navy, even though she's more qualified than anybody else who they're trying to put in these positions. They're just looking at non-white, non-male people and saying, you're not qualified because of your body parts and the color of your skin. And the way they try to convince us that this is the right thing to do is they say, well, if we give you set-asides, right? If we try to make this situation better, then the entire country is going to look at you as if you're weak, and that's going to stigmatize you.
And you'll be sad because they'll not think you're qualified.
No, first of all, we're already stigmatized by telling us that we're not capable of holding these jobs. You're already stigmatizing us. That's number one. Number two, if you look at the other country that had the highest importation of enslaved people, of African people, Brazil, and look at what they have done with racial quotas, specifically when it comes to federal universities, these people are lying. Right. They're just straight up lying. And so, I wrote this article after the Supreme Court overturned affirmative action for good in the Harvard and UNC cases. As I started looking into what Brazil had done, it became even more clear to me that we are choosing to make sure that Black people can not even get a leg up, just get a leg, right? Like we just want a leg. Yeah. And, Brazil, they had a law of social quotas that mandated that about half of the applicants accepted into federal universities must have attended public high schools, come from low-income families, or be members of racial minorities. So right
that's
there,
class and race.
Yeah. So right there, that takes one of the talking points of American policymakers in that, well, race isn't an exact one-to-one for class. It's not. It's close. But hey, I'm fine with giving poor white people a leg up as well.
I'm not mad at it. I don't want Clem and Vern to be stuck with no teeth for the rest of their damn lives. I want everybody to come along and get along because I'm a black woman who cares about everybody.
Like Cletus, the slack-jawed yokel, go to Harvard if he can get into Harvard, right? Like, I feel like that is something that we need to do. So of the half of the people that had to be set aside for low income or public high schools or members of racial minorities, half of that half, those spots were reserved exclusively for Black people, mixed race people, and indigenous Brazilians, right? And then low income people, students attended public schools. They received the other half of those set asides. So we're talking set asides based on class and race. And you know what happened? Over the course of a decade, the increase in Black enrollment at federal universities in Brazil shot up by 400%.
Jesus.
400%. And there was subsequent research that showed that it did not lower the academic quality of those schools. It did not stigmatize those Black students. These affirmative action programs led to higher graduation rates. It led to more Black students attaining leadership roles in Brazilian government, in Brazilian society, right? There was no stigma. There was just no stigma. That's not a thing that happened. And so when you look at the only other country to have as high of an importation rate when it came to enslaved Africans, and you look at Brazil trying to do these things for their indigenous people, for the Afro-Brazilians that now live there, and then you look at the United States that gave Black people 13 years in the late 60s and early 70s, and then said, no, that's not fair. It's not fair to white people. White people didn't discriminate. White people didn't own slaves. White people this, white people that. I don't care. Like, I honestly do not care if Johnny White guy didn't own a slave, his ancestors didn't own a slave. If you are a wealthy white person in this country, you have benefited from your ancestors' evil doings. And that is just a fact, right? So I don't care about, whether or not you as a white person had anything to do with the material circumstances of Black people in this country right now. That's number one. Number two, I know I'm ranting, but I'm very heated about this.
No, we're here for it. We allow space for an Imani rant.
I love that. Number two is that this whole idea that we need to be colorblind is not, A, it's nonsense, and B, it doesn't help Black people. We need to be color conscious. Color conscious means you take into account what someone's race, what their background is, how this country has treated those people, and you account for that, right? Diversity, this idea that we are going to let Black people into schools or non-white people into schools because of diversity. We need, what is diversity? Diversity does nothing for Black people. It does nothing for low-income people. It does nothing for marginalized people. Doesn't
it give us access to opportunity, Imani? Doesn't it allow us a pipeline or a pathway to spaces?
Racial quotas do that as well. Racial quotas do that as well. And they do it intentionally. What diversity does is it allows Johnny Q white person who's coming from some prep school in New York and is going to Harvard, and Johnny Q white person is, okay, let's not say New York, because New York is very diverse, from Connecticut, Johnny Q white person coming from Greenwich, Connecticut, went to the best prep schools in Connecticut and is now going to Yale. And at Yale, they're going to meet their first Black person, their first poor person, their first South Asian person, their first whatever non-white person. And what that person is doing for Johnny Q white person is allowing that person to expand their horizons, to meet have their first Black friend, their first coffee with a poor person, so that when they go on to become a titan of whatever industry they're going to become a titan of, they can go in and say, oh yeah, I know, I have a Black friend. So what is it doing for the Black person? The Black person that spent their entire life dealing with white people like Johnny Q white person. It tokenizes Black people for the benefit of white people, and it doesn't do anything for the Black people.
So is diversity like more of an affirmative action program for white people to get a Black friend?
In my view, it absolutely is. It is. It just makes it so that, I talked to my podcast co-host, Jess Peeklow. I was talking to her about this. She was like, yeah, I was that white girl from Nebraska who, she grew up very liberal. Her dad was like a civil rights attorney. I mean, she's about as woke as a white girl can get, but she still went to Wisconsin. That's where she made a Black friend that she's still really close friends with today. Right. She's like,
and her name is not Imani Gandy. Like, she's got more than one
right.
Black
There's
person
another
in her
one.
life.
Right.
Wow, too.
And so this is what I mean. Like, for white folks, diversity helps them understand what it's like to be around non-white folks. But for non-white folks, we know what it's like to be around white folks, right? We know, we have to know white folks better than they know themselves, because they can be dangerous to us in the workplace, in school, what have you. So what does diversity do for us? We need reparations. And if we're not going to get a straight up check from the government, then the least this country can do is set aside some spaces for us at Ivy League schools or any other schools anywhere to give us a chance to attain those higher echelons of society. And we're not being given that chance.
Now, Imani, not only are we not being given that chance, and the chances we had are being snatched away left, right, and center faster than a Klan can get a cross burning. Like, it's happening quickly. It's happening very quickly. But when we think about, Vern, the slack-jawed yokel, and their need to get access to things, when we think about Keisha's need to get access to things, and to Tyrone's need to get access to things, and we have this reality where we recognize that the reason that Black people, the reason that poor people generally might need a leg up is because this society is in very much highly stratified. But what we also have, Imani, is a reality where now white people, as a class, are seeking to be considered a protected class, much in the way that Black people are being Black, being Latino, Asian in society. Those are protected racial categories, protected by the Voting Rights Act. And these are communities that are protected because there has been a recognition historically that these communities get the worst of the worst, and they get the short end of all the stick. And so when it comes to, for example, voting rights and voter suppression, we know that these communities tend to be voter suppressed more than others. And so back when we had a federal Voting Rights Act, we now have one in New York State. Thank you to the advocates who helped to make that happen. But when we had a federal Voting Rights Act, if you were a part of a community that was subject to pre-clearance, which meant that your community had a history of being racist in its accessibility and making the ballot accessible to a variety of communities. And so because of this history of being racist or discriminatory, if you were going to change anything in your electoral laws, you had to get pre-clearance on those changes. And that was because of this recognition that this community has a history of being a bad actor. White people were not protected by that. And white people were not protected by that because white people have never been able to establish that they have been discriminated against when it comes to getting access to the voting booth because of their race. But we now have a case that is making its way up to the Supreme Court, where a white woman is essentially saying that she was discriminated against for being white and straight. And while the facts are particular to this case, there are many who fear that this is a case that's being used to essentially blow up the 1964 Civil Rights Act's capacity to protect racial minorities from discrimination as against white people, and will instead make it applicable to everybody. How does that reality factor into what it is that you're saying, which is like, no, we need racial set-asides because y'all ain't gonna do what's right. Y'all ain't did what's right. We need racial quotas the same way that they had in Brazil. And I love the way that you describe it. I actually referenced you highly in some local cable news conversations that I was having here in Brooklyn as a result of this article. But how does this effort from white Americans to expand the protections of against racial discrimination to include themselves, how does that factor into all of this?
I mean, I think we are in a period of equal protection backlash, right? The Equal Protection Clause, as you said, is now being used to protect white people from other white people, I guess, or to protect white people from the unqualified Black people that they believe are taking their jobs or their placements in school or what have you. The Ames case that you're talking about is an interesting one because in that case, some of the courts were saying, if you are a member of a majority group and you are claiming that you are discriminated against, then you need to prove that the person or the organization that is discriminating against you has a policy of discriminating against majority people, right? Like you can't just come in and say, oh, I'm being discriminated against because of my race. You have to prove that the company that you're working for has a policy of discriminating against the majority. And that's one of the planks of the test that the court will use to analyze the issue. I haven't really landed on my opinion on what my opinion on that is. I understand from a constitutional standpoint that it's not likely to pass constitutional muster, but I think that's because we are focused on this idea of diversity and not this idea of equity, not this idea of who deserves what and for what reason, right? Because if I recall the facts of that case correctly, it doesn't really seem like she was discriminated against because she was gay.
Right.
Everybody in question here is white. Right. And it didn't seem like this company has had a policy or a pattern of discriminating against straight people in favor of gay people. And so, am I really concerned about what the court ruling is going to be? Not really. I would like to go back and revisit all of the other cases that talk about how we're not doing quotas, we're not doing set-asides, we're only concerned about, is this gay person going to add a sprinkle of diversity to the job or to the school or to whatever? Sure, we should make sure that we are not sending straight white cis kids to schools that are only populated by straight white cis kids. But I'm not sure that going about it by having courts create new tests about how these claims are analyzed is really going to do it. I think what we need as a national conversation is a return to actual quotas. And we need to push back on these policymakers who pretend that they really are concerned about the marginalized person and about how stigmatized the marginalized person will be. And so we shouldn't do these quotas because it's really actually bad for Black people.